Hello and welcome to Opwall's Field Notes, a podcast created by Operation Wallacea to share stories and insights from our 25 years working in the field. My name is Sophia Wood, Opwall's country manager for Ecuador and director of Friends of Wallacea, and I will be your host for this series. We launched this podcast to shine a light on the world of biodiversity field research and the work of those who dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting our planet. Each month, we have conversations with scientists, community conservationists, and experienced academics about new research, protecting biodiversity, and daily life out in the field. Our guest today is Scott Sveiven, the director of Opwall's U.S. office and country manager for our Guyana expeditions. Originally from Minnesota, Scott started traveling the world and exploring his passion for wildlife biology from an early age. He went on to become a biologist, studying dual master's degrees in conservation biology and environmental policy, then teaching at a forestry school in New York State until he found his way to Opwall. Over the past decade, Scott has built and shaped Opwall's research efforts in Guyana, a country that still retains 87% of its forest cover. Since Opwall Guyana has many camps, today we will focus on one site in particular, the Iwokrama International Centre for Rainforest Conservation and Development, which works with indigenous communities to protect the forest through several different mechanisms. In this episode, we'll discuss how Scott became passionate about conservation and forestry, challenges of working in the field at one of our remotest sites, and what we've learned in 10 years of running research in Guyana. Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us today. Since we're taping everything from home, where are you based right now?
So I am in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, in Stanton, which is where the U.S. office is based for Operation Wallacea.
Awesome. And before we get into your work at Opwall, what were you doing before you got to where you are today? And kind of what inspired you to become a scientist in the first place?
Yeah, so before coming to work for Opwall, immediately prior to that, I was teaching at a forestry college in the Adirondacks. So working with students in kind of a similar natural setting, teaching them dendrology, forest ecology, wildlife management. It was a pretty remote location, but pretty fantastic. I got to spend about half my time outside. Before that, I was working on my graduate degrees in Syracuse. I did my master's research with the National Park Service out in the Rockies. So I spent a couple summers out there collecting data on wetland plant communities, riparian systems, and I also did a concurrent master's while I was in grad school in public administration. So that's kind of the years that led up to Opwall. And in terms of sort of what inspired me to become a scientist in the first place, kind of a combination of things. You know, I was, as a young kid, I always loved animals, absolutely just sort of nuts about whatever sort of animals I could find and learning all about them. And as I sort of went on and got into sort of high school and started taking sort of biology courses, it just came very naturally to me. So that kind of led me to pursue a bachelor's degree, going to college for initially it was fisheries and wildlife. I kind of just ended up getting a general biology degree. And then sort of within that, I really identified conservation biology as the thing that I was most passionate about and got a little bit of exposure to like the types of jobs you could do with that. So I did a semester abroad in Kenya doing a wildlife management program, very similar to what Opwall does actually, but it's kind of stretched out over like a semester long program where you do some directed research at the end, but you do some courses throughout and learn a lot about the ecology and the context. So you can imagine like a kid that growing up from Minnesota hadn't really done much international traveling, and I sent myself off to sub-Saharan Africa, spent a semester with like 30 strangers, learning all about the wildlife in Africa. That really kind of changed the trajectory of my career in terms of my interest in travel, but also kind of a better understanding of, you know, what careers in conservation could look like, what fieldwork was like, and also just like some really awesome wildlife experiences. So, so that kind of then fed into sticking with it in grad school and a career.
Wow, that's amazing. I was about to ask you how you got involved in the international travel and expedition side of the work, because obviously it sounds like you did a lot of work in the US. So very exciting. What a cool opportunity to get to go to Kenya in undergrad and do that kind of work. Yeah. I've noticed also a lot of the people coming through the podcast, whether Opwall or outside, grew up with that absolute love of animals. So I think that might be, that's a thing that might be a defining factor for a lot of our conservation biologists, is this just obsession with animals.
Oh yeah, it's got to be a common theme.
Yes. So could you tell us a little bit more about the work you do at Opwall now?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll kind of break that down into two parts. So for most of the year, I manage the U.S. office. And so I kind of have a hand in everything from that. The U.S. office is a relatively um, small number of people, but we do recruit a fair number of students every year. The majority of what we have is high school groups from the U.S., although this year we did recruit better part of 60 college university students as well. I sort of do some of the admin stuff behind the scenes in terms of just like, budgets, forward forecasts, kind of planning out schedules, how we're going to recruit, marketing strategies. And then I also, at least previously until the pandemic and when I was a little bit earlier on in the role, I would do a lot of travel domestically to go give presentations, meet with teachers, recruit groups. A couple of years we went to national science teacher conferences. So for a lot of the year, my job is really geared around trying to make the U.S. office as successful as possible, recruiting as many students, teachers, and groups, and kind of spreading the gospel, as it were, of Opwall trips. And you build some really good relationships. A lot like the vast majority of our groups every year are repeat schools, repeat teachers. Kind of building those relationships is a huge part. Building and maintaining those relationships is a big part of what I do. And then, the rest of the year, I manage our project in Guyana. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But so, yeah, then there's the field component as well. I kind of got sent out there my first summer, not having been to like the proper South American rainforest, not having been on an Opwall project. It was a tough first year, but really learned to work with that project and really came to love it. Like it's a very special place. So
you've done the perfect segue into asking you a little bit more about the Guyana side of your work. So how long has Opwall been working in Guyana, and what are the kinds of projects and research questions that we're asking through our work there?
Yeah, so Opwall started the project in Guyana in 2011. So this summer would have been its 10th anniversary. It's a really fascinating little country. So I'm gonna give a little backdrop on what makes it stand out, because I feel like Guyana is it's not a very well known place, and that becomes very much
Absolutely.
part of its appeal. For those people listening, Guyana is one of these three small countries that sit on the shoulder of Brazil and South America. And the one we work in, Guyana, is the former British colony. Its history is really a sort of a colony until 1966. So it was a part of the British Empire. It was a sugar producing region. They're kind of famous for their Demerara is the name of the river. But if you ever see Demerara sugar, that's specifically from Guyana.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. The Demerara River is one of the major rivers there. So Demerara sugar is from Guyana. And what's interesting about it is it's the only English speaking country in South America. It's got a very unique multicultural mix. So the British it first brought slaves from Africa. So there's a significant African demographic group. But then after the British Empire abolished slavery, they brought indentured servants from India. So you have Indian, African, and then you also have Amerindian, so the indigenous communities there. And it's a really fascinating mix of cultures. So you have Indian curry, and you have sort of dishes from Africa, and people from sort of the interior. Culturally, the country is very Caribbean oriented. So it's actually a member of the Caribbean Economic Council. So the capital up along the coast, which is where most of the people live, 90% of the population lives in a narrow band along the coast, very Caribbean in feel. Even the accent, they speak like an English slang Creolese. And so the country is really pretty limited in population. Like I said, there's only about 750,000, 800,000 people in the whole country, and 90% of them live in a narrow band along the coast, which means that where we work down in the interior is it's almost entirely intact, pristine rainforest. In fact, Guyana, their landscapes are so intact that they have among the highest per capita forest cover of anywhere in the planet. In terms of original habitat, they're in the neighborhood of 80%. So it's really sort of like top tier, and that makes it an excellent place to go study conservation, to study biodiversity. So it's a really neat project. Just in general, that's sort of the context and setup. And then within that, sort of the work we're doing there, some of the main research questions have to do with sort of the ways you could use a forest to extract some economic value. So they have a reduced impact logging scheme there. And we're kind of there to help them understand their own sort of protocols within that, and how is that impacting the biodiversity? So I think there's kind of going to lead us into a little bit more specifically about the Iwokrama forest. Maybe let's jump right on that. But
yeah, go ahead.
The place all right, yeah. The place we work specifically there is called the Iwokrama Forest. It's 3,700 square kilometers, about 1 million acres. Absolutely massive chunk of lowland tropical rainforest. It was set aside officially in 1996. And the idea behind it was, could you use this chunk of forest as a model for the way other tropical forests might be managed? And the idea behind it was, can you basically maintain the integrity of the forest, but also provide some economic value to sort of not just fund the management of the forest, but also some benefits to the local communities? And so that's exactly what they did. So the forest is essentially divided roughly in half. Half is wilderness preserve, pretty remote stuff, to be honest, but like you're not really allowed in there. It'll be very difficult to get to. You know, these are areas that there's no people, basically. There's no structures. There's only one main road through the whole forest anyway. So it's wilderness preserve. And then the other half is sustainable use. And the sustainable use included a couple different things, actually. So there's some ecotourism. So there's the Iwokrama River Lodge, and also Ada Lodge, which is the only canopy walkway in all of the Guyanas. It's one of our research sites. It's a pretty cool place. But overall, like Guyana's, it's tourism is increasing, but it's not a huge economic driver there. Even if you get to Guyana, getting down to Iwokrama's, if you're driving, it's like a 12-hour bus journey. So it's quite remote. They also have some non-timber forest products. So they were raising arapaima, blue morpho butterflies in the villages. But the main sustainable use economic activity is this reduced impact logging. And the idea behind this is, when you go into plan your cuts, your logging cuts, you're doing it with a very high level of precision and care and planning. So you do it in a way where you minimize the amount of, say, for example, forest access roads, skid trails that you need to put in. You reduce or you remove a very limited number of trees, but high value individuals. And so it's a method they've been using there. Their timber is Rainforest Line certified, I think it is, a National Forest Standard certified. But it's basically a way to go in and do some logging where you try to leave the structure of the forest and hopefully its biodiversity intact. And so that's basically where Opwall comes in. Iwokrama itself was already doing this work, but we're just helping them kind of understand the biodiversity between sites. So the way our project there works is we actually have, it's a mobile project. So we have a number of different camps. Some of them are basically on the edge of that wilderness preserve. So there is no tourism, there's no people. They're like basically out in the middle of the rainforest, like remote rainforest. We're talking like 5-hour boat journey to get to these places. There's one site that's actually in the area that's been logged, which is really interesting. I actually love that site because it's in a little bit different forest type, but there we can actually kind of see, do we see significant differences in density of large mammals or bird community or whatever it is. And then there's a couple other sites that are more in that sustainable use area, but like light tourism. So like I said, Canopy Walkway at the Ada Lodge, and also a place called Turtle Mountain, which has like groups that go stay there. And so that's basically what Opwall's involved in, is trying to monitor and understand, how is this logging activity or this tourism, are we seeing significant differences across these sites?
Wow, what an exciting place, and what a unique, opportunity to get to compare two areas with very different uses within, a specific piece of forest. That's obviously a scientist's dream, to get a control area and something that's had something different happen to it. So how long have we been doing this comparison study? And I guess, what have the main findings and takeaways been over the last few years about the impact of mixed use forests on biodiversity?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So that basic setup has been kind of the main framing of the project since we got involved, because it's one of the key things that Iwokrama themselves as our partner are interested in sort of monitoring. And again, the logging operation is kind of seasonal. They've switched contractors for actually doing it. So there's been some gaps and some good reasons to kind of continue with this sort of monitoring work. The other part I'll mention too is a couple of the sites are accessed through our other partner, which is the Amerindian village of Sarama. And so there the focus is, we use them as control sites, but the focus is a little bit different because they don't really have logging. So that's more about working with one of the indigenous Amerindian communities to promote, sort of document the wildlife that they have, but also sort of help promote sort of the ecotourism side of what they're doing, so they have an income stream coming in. And they have established themselves as sort of the preeminent original, eco lodge in the region. But in terms of big picture, what we've been finding in general is that it looks like the areas that have had the logging activity done, you do not see significant declines in biodiversity. In fact, a little bit counterintuitive. And like I said, there's some site-specific things that you'd have to control for here, because the logging area itself is on a patch of white sand forest, which means the substrate's different, means the plant community is a little bit different. It also means that you can actually do logging there. It'd be really impossible in a lot of the areas because it'd just be too muddy, whereas this white sand doesn't quite have that same problem. But what we tend to find is pretty high densities of a lot of, say for large mammals in the areas that have been logged. And it appears part of what's happening here, not surprisingly, is these forest trails or roads that have been carved, same way that make it easy for us to walk in and survey using this transect. We find a lot of signs of wildlife using them as corridors. And again, because of that white sand, it's very easy to find tracks. So we always find tons of like puma and jaguar and tapir tracks. One of the really interesting findings I remember from a couple years ago is a gentleman who's now Dr. Matt Hallett. He was working on his PhD throughout large camera trapping study, sort of throughout Guyana. Iwokrama was just a part of it. But I remember I think it was 2016, he was very excited because in one of the areas that have been logged that we were surveying, he had a camera trap out, and he actually documented bush dogs, which is exciting because they're fairly elusive to begin with, but it's also sort of generally thought that they are quick to leave an area if there's a large amount of disturbance. So to find them using these areas that had previously been logged. Now, again, previously, so it's been a couple of years, but all positive signs. If you start to look a little bit more specifically within that, you get some variation, right? And find certain bat species, for example, at different parts of the forest that has probably more to do with habitat than logging. But that's sort of the general picture of what we've found in sort of the monitoring we've been doing.
Well, very exciting stuff. And obviously, this is a very unique conservation model that's happening in Iwokrama that you're talking about. Not a lot of places on Earth do mixed use forests. Usually it's either people, it's people here, animals here. So, why did the Guyanese government and maybe the communities set up Iwokrama in this way? What was the goal? And do you think is it being achieved by this unique conservation method?
Yeah. So like I said, I think the goal, Guyana's, it's interesting because it has a unique opportunity compared to a lot of countries to actually take a more thoughtful approach to some of their conservation and also some of their development initiatives. So, like I said, it's got 80%, in the neighborhood of 80% of its original forest cover. Most of the people live along the coast. So a lot of the interior is like a really intact habitat. Now there's some small scale mining, there's some small scale logging. I mean, there's bits, but compared to most places, they have had a chance to learn some lessons from what's happened in a lot of other countries. And so I think that was part of what went into the Iwokrama forest is they said, okay, well, we've got all of this amazing intact forest, but we've also got local communities down there. We want to provide some revenue. They're also just known for being pretty proactive in wanting to develop a green economy. And so these things came together with the Iwokrama forest. And like I said, it was really kind of meant to be like a model, like an experimental model of, can you basically take a forest and have some sort of development and economic output, but also maintain its essential character, wilderness, and biodiversity. And I mean, I think it absolutely has worked. I mean, it's one of the best managed forests in the tropics that I've ever seen. It helps that there's a limit to how much actual pressure there is from outside forces there because it's a remote place. I know they have small scale poaching and logging, but it's also manned full time with rangers and people on patrol. And it's got a lot of, I think, popular support. So I think it's been a pretty successful model. I mean, of course, there's pros and cons and there's ups and downs. And I think we'll come back to it. Their tourism's completely died off from the pandemic, but overall as a general experiment, general model, I think it's been really successful.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about tourism because obviously, it's one of the mixed uses that you mentioned and presumably funds some of the protection of the area through rangers and people being there. And, talked to several partners about the fact that just having tourists in a place makes it harder for people to poach. So I guess, has there been a gap in conservation funding for Iwokrama because of the lack of tourism? Obviously, we can imagine there's a gap in data because Opwall hasn't been able to get there. But has the lack of tourism hurt the model in any way this year?
It has. I know that it's in particular like the element of the forest that was geared toward tourism. So that Iwokrama River Lodge, that was basically closed entirely for a long stretch. I believe it's now reopened. They are taking tourists, but yes, that had a huge impact on that element of what they do. Luckily, though, in a sense, like for the overall conservation aims and for the forest itself, like it's not like tourism was the only arrow in the quiver, so to speak. And like I said, it's one income stream for them, but luckily not the only one. And so it certainly hurt. But, on the other hand, as I've sort of tracked it and been involved in Guyana for long enough now, it does have an emerging reputation from what I could tell as like one of these up and coming ecotourist destinations, which is very rightly deserved. In fact, their slogan is Guyana is South America undiscovered. And I think, I've traveled quite a bit through other parts of South and Central America. Like, I think that's pretty fair. And so, with the pandemic, it's certainly been a hit, but like the long-term trajectory, I think, is still pretty positive overall. And it's like I said, it's got one of these unique features that once you get down to the interior, it has a sense of like, it hasn't been corrupted in a sense by a massive influx of tourism. People down there are still very genuine. So it's like this really interesting sort of balance where you want to help promote and endorse more ecotourism down in this region, but also the fact that it's been like very well controlled and kind of minimal, and like you have to really put some work in to get down here, has also like kept a lot of the pressures for development at bay, which has got some good things. So it's kind of going at a slow pace, but there's some benefits to that.
Well, there's obviously, pros and cons. I think, from what you've talked about, and obviously my own work with the government and tourism in Guyana, they're very, very thoughtful about developing tourism in partnership with communities in, at low levels that don't create such significant impacts, as obviously a lot of people have seen tourism in natural areas and not natural areas around the world. So I was going to ask you, what other countries or even conservation projects could learn from how Guyana works to engage their indigenous communities in conservation, because obviously they're such a great example from everything that you're talking about. Wonder what lessons other countries or projects could take from this work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a little bit hard to answer because in some respects the indigenous communities in Guyana, from my understanding and from what I've witnessed firsthand and talking to them, they have, compared to indigenous peoples in most other parts of the world, they have maintained a much greater degree of autonomy, ability to sort of determine their own course of action, and also just straight up like their land, right? So the indigenous community of Sarama and also Fairview, which is the village near Iwokrama, I mean, they were instrumental in actually establishing Iwokrama themselves. They were big proponents of setting it up. And they've had the support of, I think, like, various administrations over time. But there's also sort of like this unique situation in Guyana where, like I said, like the vast majority of people live along the coast, and what the areas we're talking about where the indigenous communities we work with anyway are down sort of away from that. So there is a sense of separation, and that also feeds into their ability for self-determination and autonomy. But one of the things that I think, sort of could be broadly applicable to other places is, in the case of Guyana, allowing these indigenous communities to have a stake in the establishment of this forest, but then also an economic stake at the table. And so again, that's variable. Like in the case of by establishing the forest, that's part of what drives tourism to, say, Sarama, right? Our other partner in it. And that's a model that exists in other parts of sort of the interior of Guyana, and so that gives them both an incentive to be involved in conservation, but also an incentive to stick with it and maintain it. And I mean, that's not like unique to, where we're working there. That's kind of the golden rule with working with indigenous communities, but it's certainly one that I like to highlight about the Guyana project, because the people we work with down there are just so welcoming and fantastic, and they're happy to share their knowledge of the forest, but they're also really happy to learn from the scientists and students. And so they're really great partners and a great group of people to make sure you have involved in what's going on in these kind of conservation decisions.
Well, it sounds like maybe the lesson is allow indigenous communities to keep their land from the start, or give it back, so that they can make decisions about it. Obviously, that's something we've seen over and over again. Good to know that it's repeated here, and it's a great example here of where indigenous communities obviously have maintained and been able to maintain their land. So I guess to kind of round out our discussion of Iwokrama, I guess this might be a big question, but given your background in forestry, I guess I'll ask, can we draw bigger conclusions about local forest use from the Iwokrama project? Basically, is it possible to log sustainably?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some applicable lessons here. Yeah, I mean, when done with thought and care, logging can absolutely be sustainable. I mean, forests are naturally renewable resources in many ways, which, in some sense can be thought of like a crop. And it's for that reason, actually, here in the US, that the US Forest Service is actually under the Department of Agriculture, whereas the National Park Service is part of the Department of the Interior, right? So there is that connection between managing forests and them being renewable. At the same time, one of the things that I think is important to kind of note about the Iwokrama model is, like I said, it's not like the entire forest is subject to logging. Around the world, unfortunately, logging has not been done sustainably throughout human history. And so we've lost almost all of our valuable old growth forest, which itself, aside from its carbon value and inherent sort of ecological value, there's certain species that really need various types of old growth. And so one of the things that's really cool about the model in Iwokrama is, like I said, like huge chunks of the forest, about half of the forest was completely off limits to any sort of development or logging whatsoever. And it's a small part of it that was most suited for logging that's being logged. And then within that's being done in a really sustainable way. So, I mean, I think that is a useful model. Again, it's how that applies is going to depend on what specific type of forest you're talking about, what the pressures are. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really cool model to see how, in some cases for conservationists, logging can be pointed at sometimes as sort of this, like fern gully enemy. And that's not necessarily the case at all. Like, logging can be really beneficial for forests. It can be really beneficial for wildlife. It can be really beneficial for local people. It's just a question about how it's managed and sort of how you roll those things together. And that's where I think the Iwokrama forest and model is really insightful for other places.
That's great. Thank you for explaining that in such depth, and obviously it's such an exciting model. Look forward to seeing how it continues to evolve over the coming years. As we round out, I wanted to shift into a little bit more of your experience in the field. And obviously, you said when you started working in Guyana, it was your first time in the South American rainforest, which I obviously know from personal experiences also can be quite shocking on the system. What were the lessons that you learned, I guess, from living in the rainforest? What did you have to learn to survive in that first year or over the last 10 years?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, working in a place like Guyana in the wet season is it's challenging, but it's also one of these things that becomes really, really rewarding. One of my favorite things about being down there every summer is it's always this, and I'm sure you can relate to this, but it's always this massive switch between being constantly bombarded with, your phone and email notifications and all of this, and you get down there, and once you get out to these sites, it's like, I mean, most of them, there's no electricity. We run a generator a few hours a day. You're completely disconnected.
I think that's my favorite part.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's like, it's always a transition. It's like kind of a weird one, but then once you get used to it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. And one of the things that really stands out to me is and and it's great to watch students go through this as well, is all of a sudden all of these distractions go away and you're much more engaged with the people that are around you, whatever you're doing, the natural environment, the life there. And that's part of, if you were to ask me sort of one of my favorite things, or what do you need to survive? It's like you learn to really lean into the people on site. And Guyana has been great because it's relatively small. And a lot of times, I have students that come out, uni students come out for like 4 weeks. And so you get to spend some time with these people, really getting to know them, making friendships, and my staff as well, the science staff, the local staff. It's such a unique thing, but like I have just a huge number of people that want to come back year after year after year after year. And part of that's just like Guyana itself has this weird way of like hooking people in, but certainly part of it's the camaraderie that we've developed over the years. And so that's one of the things that stands out in my mind is just you get out to this place and everything shuts off and you're just completely immersed in this really biodiverse, really crazy rainforest environment. And it's not easy, like it's raining every day, and there's chiggers, and there's there's stuff you got to watch out for, but at the same time, like it's been a real joy to get to do that, and to get to do it for a number of years, and to build it into this sort of like long-term project from my personal end. And I've had a lot of students that I've gotten to see now go on to master's degrees or PhDs, or working in really cool wildlife jobs, and certainly like kind of know that Guyana played a role in that. So
well, I very much relate to the idea of putting your phone away. I notice my phone battery tends to last an entire week when I'm in the jungle, because I don't even really take it out of my tent, or turn it on, or do anything with it at all, besides take the occasional picture of a frog.
Yep, and for an alarm or something like that.
Exactly. Yep. So it's very different. I usually say my top lesson learned is that karma works faster in the rainforest, and it just catches it'll do something to you if you're mean to someone else, which I think falls into that camaraderie part.
Oh yeah. No, there's not much room for like serious discord in these remote field camps down there, and like you're with these people, so like you basically have to get along. And so that's part of my role as the manager, like troubleshooting that, but like a lot of it just flows from having a jovial sense of like the staff, and like if you're having fun and your team is having fun, that's going to flow down to everyone else.
Absolutely. Well, what's the craziest or coolest thing you've seen while working in the field?
Oh man, there's so many contenders for that. I mean, in terms of like, I'll give you a couple just examples. Like in terms of mammals, like mammals that I've seen down there. I remember one time I was on my own, actually, kind of just out on the edge of camp, and I saw a giant anteater, which like they're the craziest
so cool
animals, like racing stripe and big giant bushy tail and this little like bottle head. That was really cool. Guyana is amazing for its bat diversity. It's got the highest bat diversity of any Opwall site. So I remember finding it's kind of intense, but like Woolly Falls vampire bat, which is like the largest carnivorous bat, I think in the world, I believe, which is this monster. And then like we found a baby mata turtle one year, like a little silver dollar size baby mata turtle, and that was one of my favorite herps. But there's so many things. There's been so many cool snakes and birds, and just all kinds of great stuff.
You guys do see a lot of wild stuff out there that I think that are harder to see in other parts of the Amazon, obviously, just because of how remote you are. Well, to end us out on a positive note, I wanted to ask you why you personally believe we should keep fighting to protect biodiversity and prevent climate change, and really what gets you out of bed in the morning.
It's always kind of the $1 million question, I think, for conservationists, or really just humanity in general. And I don't think there's like one line of argument to make. Like I do personally feel like there's an ethical and moral component to this, where rapacious exploitation of resources for sort of cheap development that's not well thought out, that comes at the expense of an elimination of an entire species, is just, I think you can make a strong case that that's immoral. It's also, you could say, inevitable. Like the earth has always been changing and dynamic, and species do come and go. But when it's specifically at the ends of thoughtless exploitation by people, I think that's a it's a legacy that, I don't think we should want to leave to future generations. And so I think for a lot of conservationists, that's part of what you're doing is you're trying to fight the good fight, even though it does sometimes feel like it's a losing battle. It's one that's worth fighting. And like I said, I personally, I think there's an inherent value and right to exist for species and for natural processes and the natural world. As far as climate change, it kind of ties into the same idea. Climate change is one of these just monumental, complex problems that, we've built a system that is a bit of a runaway juggernaut, and there's a lot of agreement for a lot of people that climate change is unfolding in front of us, right? I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to have seen it kind of develop in my lifetime.
Even I'm old enough to have seen it, I think.
yeah. And then at the same time, the structural barriers and the economic barriers to addressing it are daunting. But one of the things I like to think about with Opwall and these projects is, by bringing these students out every year, and it's small scale, but we're in theory training and inspiring a whole army of young people to be passionate advocates for change. And sooner or later, change seems impossible until it happens.
Love that. Well, you're the second person now to refer to Opwall as an army of conservationists, and I like to think of us that way. Well, as my last question, I just wanted to ask you what you're most looking forward to for the next field season.
I think like everybody, just getting out, getting out of being locked down. That's got to be pretty high on the list after a year, just kind of going stir crazy at times. And then, like I said, kind of the people. I've made a lot of good friends and connections down there, and definitely be looking forward to seeing them and hanging out in the rainforest again.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your time today, Scott, and your thoughts on Iwokrama and your work in Guyana and elsewhere. It was great to hear about the project. Have a great rest of your day.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And you have a good rest of your day too.
Thank you for tuning in to Opwall's Field Notes. We hope you enjoyed our adventure through the rainforests of Guyana with Scott. A special thanks to our podcast producer, Mike Judson, and editor, Beth Newark, who make this and every episode possible. Make sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on new episodes about conservation and biodiversity hotspots around the world, coming soon on Opwall's Field Notes.